Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video, and it is November 11th. It is the 103rd anniversary of the Armistice, of the ceasefire in the war to end all wars, the Great War, World War I as we know it today. And contrary to popular belief, well, I shouldn't say popular belief, but there do seem to be a lot of folks who are commenting. I want to set the record straight. This is not the Treaty of Versailles. This is not the end of the war. This is a ceasefire. This is a cessation of hostilities. The actual Treaty of Versailles is not signed until the summer of 1919. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this, and I'm going to have this going live at 11 a.m. Paris time. So a lot of you will be seeing this right at that moment. And I just want to take the time to thank all of you who have been commenting on the videos, sharing your own family's connections to this war. Please keep that coming. So if you have a family member of some kind who either served or especially if they served and died during this conflict, please comment in the comment section below. Let me know their story. I would love to hear their story. Let's dive into today's video.
The Armistice, November 11th, 1918. In autumn 1918, after 4 years of devastating war, Germany was on the verge of economic and social collapse. With the spring offensive ending in failure, all hopes were gone that Germany could win the war.
So that's an important distinction to make, because you don't hear him saying they were on the verge of military collapse, because the primary causes for the inability to win the war for the Germans really does come down to economy and the situation back home. The naval blockade, which had been going on now for the better part of 4 years, had just been reducing the home front to having nothing. They were starving. The situation was untenable, and that was part of why the spring offensive takes place. It's a desperate gamble by the Germans to win the war before things collapse completely at home, but also before the Americans can really enter the war in force. America declares war in April of 1917. In that intervening year, the buildup is starting to happen. There are troops arriving all the time. The Eastern Front collapses for the Allies. The Russians are out of the war because of their own problems at home and the civil war that erupts there and the overthrow of their monarchy. And so the Americans arrive, and they're going to stabilize and really kind of turn things around on the West. So this spring offensive happens to kind of make this last gamble to try and end the war in the West before it just can't happen anymore. And that's where they're at. So the Kaiser ends up having to step down. Things fall apart on the home front, and there's just no way that the Germans can win the war. And everybody knew this by the time the Meuse-Argonne offensive takes place at the end of September, beginning of October. Everybody pretty much knows the war's over.
In late September 1918, the French, American, and British troops started the offensive on the entire Western Front, putting great pressure on the exhausted German forces. General Ludendorff resigned and was replaced by Wilhelm Groener. The whole army was severely lacking morale. By the beginning of November, all of its allies, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, had been defeated, so Germany was left fighting alone. Germany was also caught by winds of political change. Soldiers began to revolt, and protests and revolutions erupted in the big German cities.
So this is why you get a lot of people, in particular those who will go on to form the National Socialists, who start to come up with what they call the stab in the back theory, which is basically Germany couldn't be defeated on the battlefield. The only reason that we lost the war is because people back home stabbed our own country in the back. And it was the Bolsheviks and it was the Jews. And this will kind of start to plant the seeds for that hatred toward communists, toward Jewish people, towards other groups that they held responsible for not only the war, but the aftermath and the economic collapse that takes place in Germany during the intervening years before World War II.
The imperial government was replaced by a democratic one, while Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and went into exile to the Netherlands.
Which is where he's still living when World War II happens. And, of course, the Nazis invade and take over the Netherlands, and there's Kaiser Wilhelm still alive when that all takes place. Now, he dies in the middle of World War II, but he's still alive to see Hitler's rise to power and Germany's domination of of Europe in World War II, all the things that they tried to do in World War I.
A total chaos in the country and a complete breakdown on the front lines. The Germans were desperate to sign a truce. Germany did try to negotiate peace conditions with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson earlier in October, but were reluctant to make the great concessions that the other allies demanded. This time, the Republican government was ready to accept any conditions asked by the allies. The meeting was arranged to be held far away from the eyes of the public, in the forest of Compiègne, 40 miles or 65 kilometers north of Paris. Negotiations were led by German State Secretary Matthias Erzberger and Marshal Foch, who was delegated by the Allies to sign the truce. For the occasion, Marshal Foch's train carriage was brought in as a place of formal signing of the armistice. For the Allies, there was no room for any kind of negotiations.
So, and that train carriage then becomes symbolic in World War II, because that's where Adolf Hitler requires the French to sign their surrender in World War II, and then he has it blown up afterwards.
Instead, they just handed over to Germany their terms of unconditional surrender. The German delegation could only object on the number of submarines that were to be handed over to the Allies, but they were asked to hand over more than they actually had. The armistice was to cease all hostilities on the land, air, and sea. The German army was asked to leave the occupied territories of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine in 15 days, as well.
Now, Alsace-Lorraine is actually, at the beginning of the war, owned by the Germans. So this is really, at least in the West, this is the main territorial concession that Germany has to give up, is that disputed region that had gone back and forth over the years, depending on who won wars and things like that.
Well as to repatriate all the inhabitants of the same territories and Allied prisoners of war. The Germans also had to evacuate its troops from the left bank of the Rhine River and to establish a demilitarized 6-mile or 10-kilometer wide buffer zone on the right bank of the river. The left bank of the Rhineland, would be occupied by French, British, Belgian, and American troops. The Germans were obliged to leave the infrastructure of this territory intact with all its industrial stores of coal and other materials. The Germans also had to surrender 2,500 heavy guns, 2,500 field guns, 25,000 machine guns, 3,000 trench mortars, and 1,700 fighter and bomber airplanes. They also had to give away 5,000 locomotives with 150,000 wagons.
Now think about this, because these are the seeds that of the economic pain that Germany has put through. And you can argue whether or not this was, it was very clearly punitive, but was it punitive to the point where it just debilitated Germany's hope of recovery? Because in hindsight, it's easy to say, man, that was so stupid. Why did they do that? They kind of set the stage for the rise of Nazism and World War II. And it's absolutely true. The Treaty of Versailles, which will be signed after all of this armistice, definitely planted the seeds for World War II. But you could also make the argument, well, if you look back and see what Germany did to France after the Franco-Prussian War 50 years earlier, well, it paled in comparison to what Germany did to France. So, Germany's just getting a taste of their own medicine. That's true. It doesn't change the fact that by debilitating Germany economically at the end of the war, they set the stage for what came next.
And 5,000 lorries. All of these had to be in good, usable condition. All of these requirements were made to prevent any German attempt to continue the war. In order to secure the safety of the sea routes, the Allies required Germany to surrender all of their submarines, to completely disarm their 6 battlecruisers, 10 battleships, 8 light cruisers, and 50 modern destroyers, and to intern them into neutral ports under Allied surveillance. All other vessels were allowed to stay in German ports, but also had to be disarmed and put under Allied surveillance. Finally, on November 11th, at 5 a.m. French time, the armistice was signed by Marshal Ferdinand Foch and First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Rosalind Weems on behalf of the Allies, and Secretary of State Matthias Erzberger, Count Alfred von Oberndorf of the Foreign Ministry, General Detlev von Winterfeld, and Admiral Ernst Vancelau on the German side. The armistice came into effect 6 hours later at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Even at the time, when the peace was so close, soldiers were still dying.
And yeah, and this is one of the sad things. I mean, because everybody knew that the war was coming to a close. And then, of course, once this is signed, everybody knows it goes into effect. But you've got fighting taking place up until that minute. Even, I think, in a couple places, maybe a minute or two after. But there are stories about these last soldiers who die right at the last minute. So tragic.
Almost 3,000 men died on the last day of the war. The last British soldier to be killed on the front was George Edward Ellison from the 5th Royal Irish Lancers. He lost his life while he was on scouting duty near Mons, Belgium. Just 15 minutes before the war was ended, the last French soldier to die on the front, Augustin Trebuchet, was killed. He was shot as he was running to inform his comrades that hot soup was on the menu to celebrate the ceasefire.
Oh my gosh.
Canadian George Lawrence Price was killed 2 minutes before 11 a.m., being the last Commonwealth soldier killed in the war. A minute after, just seconds away from the armistice, an American soldier of German origin, Henry Gunther, charged at stunned German soldiers who were aware that peace was just seconds away.
Yeah, and imagine, what are these guys supposed to do? This guy's charging at them. They know that it's about to be over. They probably didn't want to kill this guy, but, oh, boy.
Gunther ended up being the last American soldier to die in the war. The last German casualty is harder to determine as records are less clear. Some records say that it was 18-year-old German soldier Alphonse Powell. He was killed only moments after hostilities ceased. He joined the army in August 1914 at the very beginning of the war.
Survived all 4 years of the war and dies a few moments after the armistice goes into effect. Oh, heartbreaking.
Many soldiers were in disbelief when they heard of the armistice, as ammunition and supplies were still arriving to front lines. However, when the news was confirmed, soldiers across the entire Western Front started to celebrate the fact that they were finally going home to their loved ones. The duration of the armistice was to be 36 days, but was prolonged on 3 occasions until peace was finally ratified on January 10, 1920.
So that's pretty optimistic. Oh, we'll get it all worked out in a month, you know? I mean, you have to wait for peace commissioners to come as far away as from Japan, because Japan was a part of the Versailles Conference, and of course they didn't get much, and they were pretty upset about it, but they didn't really contribute much to the war either, so.
Putting an end to the First World War.
All right, well, that was pretty interesting. And, you know, not a lot for me to add to that, but as I mentioned, you know, let me know in the comment section below who were your family members. Tell me their stories. People who served or especially who died in the war. And in particular, and I'll do an announcement about this. Be watching. It may already be live by the time you see this. I'm going to be going to the Western battlefields, the Western Front. And if you've got a family member that is actually buried in one of those graves, I would love to highlight them in a video if I get a chance to. So let me know. Thanks for watching.